This video is going to show you how to take an existing inventory and format it and import it into iTree Streets. This is a sort of long involved process. Hopefully I'll shorten it up when I explain it here. So I'm going to break it up into three parts. The first one will just be taking your data from another street tree inventory that you have and formatting it so that it's ready to be imported into iTree Streets. The second part, you have to get that data into an Access database first. That's just one of the steps you have to do. So the second part will go over how to get your formatted data into an Access database, and the third part will go how to get that Access database imported into iTree Streets. So I'll break those up into three separate videos. This first one about formatting your data, this actually is probably the most time-consuming step and the one where you kind of need to be the most careful. I'll try and point out along the way sort of common stumbling blocks. So the first thing I like to do when I import an existing inventory, and this is just my existing inventory here, we'll call it original data, is the very first thing you want to do is make a copy of this. So you don't want to mess up your original data. So I'm going to go ahead right off the bat and save this as, let's just call it, we'll call it my city inventory for streets. So that way any changes I make in here, if I mess something up, I'm not messing up my original data. So I have that saved. The other thing I like to do is, typically I like to have three files open. One is going to be my inventory. I like to use Excel to reformat this. If you have some other spreadsheet software, some other way to do it, that's fine. But I'm going to go through how to do it in Excel. The other thing you want to have open is the street species list, because you're going to have to convert your species codes or species names into the ones Streets expects. So I have that Excel file open, and the place to get that, if you just go to our website www.itreetools.org, and if you click on resources here and archives, it takes you to this place where we sort of keep all the documentation for the various components of iTree, and you'll see there are these streets existing inventory import resources, and this actually has some other things you might be interested in as well. The streets formatting example, that's actually the data I'm using, so if you want to follow along you could use that data as well, or you can follow along with your own data. And the species codes by climate region is what I'm working with. So that's the other Excel file I have open. And the third thing I like to have open is just the iTree Streets manual. And for this first stage, there's a table in here that is pretty helpful for doing any of this formatting, and it's down here on page 25. And it's this table here. And it just tells you all the possible variables that you can import into iTree Streets and exactly what they have to be named. So when I do this reformatting, I have to make sure each one of my columns is labeled to match up with one of these, and that it's formatted to match up one of these. So species code has to be text, and most other things have to be numbers. And I'll go through these one by one, but this is the table you want to have open, because you're going to have to create columns with each one of these names that you want to import. So just jumping back over to my data, and also this manual, you can get it from our website, or you can also get it from the help menu within iTree Streets if you have the software open. So if we go back over to our data, the first thing you have to do is decide which of these variables you want to import. So you can import everything on that list that's in the manual. Otherwise, really you only need to import the species and the diameter. With those two things, Streets will work. If you also import your condition codes, you're going to get a little more accurate estimates. So those three are the big ones to import. You can import any of this other stuff. Most of it's not going to be used in the calculations, but sometimes it can be useful to use it in summaries, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But we'll import a few different variables just so you can see how that goes, but know that really you just need to do species, diameter, and if you have it, that condition code. So I'll do those three first, and then we'll get into a couple other ones that can be useful or important. So when you do this reformatting, there's a few things that there's a few different ways you can do it. But you always want to keep track of what exactly you did, because you're going to need that information later on when you bring it into iTree. The first variable I'm going to set up here is the species, and the way I like to do this is I just like to insert a column right in my old data where I'm going to put my new data, and I like to highlight this column just so I know which ones I'm going to ultimately keep in my final project that I'm going to bring into iTree Streets. So what I have to do is iTree Streets isn't going to recognize these species codes. It has its own list of species codes, and it's not going to recognize these common names either. So we have to go ahead and convert those to the ones that iTree Streets will recognize. So that's where I need that species code table over here, and you'll see down the bottom that there's one of these for each one of the climate zones in iTree Streets. I'm going to go ahead and use the one for the Midwest for this project. So these are the species codes that Streets expects, and this is the scientific name and common name of those species. So I'm going to have to go through and say, do I have any box elders in my input data? If I do, I need to change all of those to this ACNE species code. And I'm just going to have to go through them one by one like that. If you don't know which climate zone you're in, that's another thing you can find on our website. And that's actually in the archives too, but under the Streets and Stratum resources. And if we just scroll down, we have our iTree Streets climate zone map. So you can pop that open if you like and see, which zone do you fall in. This data is actually from Wisconsin, so we're going to go ahead and call it in the Midwest region there. So that's another useful thing that's in the archives there that's worth checking out. So when I go through this, I think the easiest way, especially with the species, is I'm actually just going to copy all the data in my species column. So I'm just going to highlight all of it, and I just use the quick key Control C. You can also right click in there, and then I'll come over here and press Control V to paste. Turn my column yellow again here. So I just want to search within this column for all the ash species. And if I look again at my species table here, and let's see, those are all ash species. So I want to give them all species code FR. So I have that highlighted. I'm just going to Control F to find, and we actually want to replace here. So we want to find that ash SPP, and here you do want to make sure that you get the spelling and the capitalization correct. You can change some of that down here with these other options, so if we don't want to worry about capitalization or not, we can uncheck that match case thing. And we want to replace that with FR. So everywhere it finds that ash species in the column we have highlighted, it's going to replace it with FR. And I'm just going to hit replace all, and it tells us it made 45 replacements. And I'm just going to keep going through doing this for every single one of the species we have. If you're going to do this a lot using the same types of input species codes or common names, you may want to look into creating a lookup table or using a lookup function in Excel. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to some of the other variables where it's a little easier to show. So I'll just go through a couple more of these, and then I'll sort of pause the video and get them all formatted so you don't have to watch me format the 80 or so different species in here. And this is a sort of time-consuming step. So the next thing here is we have this elm species hybrid. So I'm just going to say that's an elm species, and let's go see what our code would be over here. And these are in alphabetical order pretty much by scientific name, so we'll just go down to Ulmus. And we do have an elm species here, and it's going to need to be ULS for our species code. So again, I'm going to click on here on the F to highlight that whole column. I hit Control F, which is my quick key for find. And in this case, I want to take that, it's elm SPP period hybrid in parentheses. So if I just wrote elm-spp, it's just going to replace that part and leave hybrid, which isn't going to do it right. So you need to make sure you kind of type those things in carefully, and the messier your input data is, the sort of more tedious this process becomes. But we'll go ahead and replace all of those, and we've made 44 replacements of that. Our next tree there is going to be sugar maple. So again, I'm going to jump over to my species table, and I'm looking for the maples now. So we go up to sugar maple, which is Acer saccharum, and this is ACSA2. So again, we're going to click on the F at the top of the column here where we want to do our replacement in, and we'll hit Control F to open up that Find Replace window again, and we're going to replace our current common name we have in there, sugar maple, with our street species code, which was ACSA2, and we'll just click on replace all to replace all of those in the area we have selected, and we can hit OK. It's made 69 replacements, and at this point I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'll go ahead and go through the rest of my species format, but rather than have you watch all that, we'll pick it up with the next variable. Okay, so I went ahead and went through all my species codes. You can see they're all pretty well filled in. I do want to show you a couple things here before I move on to another category. If I just scroll down a little bit here, you can see there are a few species that I didn't replace, and this is up to you. You can try to replace them here, but sometimes they aren't in the list of species codes that we have available, and shagbark hickory is one of those. So we'll just leave it, and we'll come back to it when we actually import into streets, and you can see the dialog that pops up if you don't enter in a species code that streets recognizes. Alternatively, you could use an other category. So if I scroll down here a little bit, let's see. So like larch or bald cypress, those also aren't in there. But if I'm not really interested in keeping track of those as sort of a separate species, I can just go ahead and assign them to that other category. So I won't be able to get results for larch or bald cypress, but I assign them to this BDL other and BDM other, which stand for broadleaf deciduous large and broadleaf deciduous medium. Of course, those aren't necessarily broadleaf trees, but again, this is sort of the judgment calls you have to make. You're trying to shoehorn the inventory you have into the framework of streets. So that happens, and that's another thing to keep in mind. And just one last important thing before we leave the species, I didn't give this column a name up here, and this is maybe one of the most important things, and sort of one of the easiest things to keep track of. So if we go back to the manual, and we see here our species code, this is exactly the name it needs to be. So you could actually highlight this and copy it, but really, any way you do it, you just need to make sure that over here it's named exactly that way. So S was capitalized, lowercase p, capital C, code. And that's how we would reformat all our species. So from there, we can go on to other categories that we want to get in there. I said that those necessary ones are species code, diameter. So let's go ahead over here and look. And here we can have, it tells me we can have categories or the actual value. In our case, we have the actual measurements, so we don't need to use DBH categories. So we'll just go ahead and leave that as is. And that has to be called DBH, all capitalized. So here they have diameter. I'm not going to change the formatting to that column at all or change the code. So I'm just going to change that to DBH and highlight it as yellow because it's one of the ones we want to use. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll just keep going through these variables. We'll go on with a couple more. I said after species code and DBH, it's good if you can also put in condition. So we have a column here in our existing inventory called condition that we'd like to bring into streets. So let's go ahead and look at what the format for the condition column would need to be. And we actually have two in streets. We have condition of wood and condition of leaves. And these are just going to be a number from 1 to 10, or 0, or blank if it's not recorded. So let's just scroll up here a little bit. There's actually a list for each one of these variables. There's an input worksheet here that you can use to either create your own categories or see what the default categories already are. So here is a table for the conditions worksheet, and you can see it has both wood and foliage here, and these are just the categories: good, fair, poor, dead, and dying, and it gives them these codes 1, 2, 3, 4. So essentially what we need to do is convert our condition codes, our condition categories, into these codes. And here I'm going to go ahead and use a lookup table so that we can do this maybe a little more efficiently. So right here next to our condition, I'm going to insert a column, and actually I'm going to insert 2 columns here, just because if we go back down here to our big table that shows all our different variables, we have both condition of wood and condition of leaves, and remember these have to be named exactly that. So let's go ahead and do that. COND wood, CONDLVS for leaves, and again these are 2 that I'm going to import, so I'm going to go ahead and turn those yellow. And I think it's also useful here, so we have this tab here. Let's go ahead and call this one data, and over here we'll just make a new one that we'll call metadata. And here we'll just create a few tables that we're going to use to keep track of how we convert these things. So we have our condition of wood table. Let's go ahead and call this one input value and call this one streets code. So we have those 2, and we want to put in some streets codes, and just like in that table before, these are just going to be numbers. Ours are just going to go up to 4. And if we look at our data here, looks like we have poor, fair, good are our categories. And we have dead as well. So I think that's fine. We can just go ahead and use the same codes that Streets is already using. So if we look at our metadata here, 1 is going to be dead, 2 is going to be poor, 3 is going to be fair, and 4 will be good. And that just matches pretty much what's in that table on page 14 for the condition of wood. While we're here, we can go ahead and make a condition of leaves one as well, and this is just going to be essentially the same because we only have one value there now. So we'll go ahead and call this condition of leaves. So we'll just set those condition of wood and condition of leaves to the same thing in this case, and that's fine for these 2 variables because Streets actually combines them inside the software. So once we have this metadata, it's actually a little easier to go ahead and populate these. So we could do the same thing we did before where we copied these over and did a copy and replace. But in this case, let's go ahead and use the lookup function in Excel. The way a lookup function works in Excel, you just hit the equals because you're going to use a function, and it's just called lookup. So I type lookup and open parentheses, and it wants to know the value it's going to look up. So we want to look up poor and find out what condition code to give it. So I just clicked on my first value there, and you press comma. Now it wants to know the vector that it's going to look that up in, and that's just the list that it's going to look in. So let's jump over to our metadata. We just want it to find poor in this list, and I did highlight that. I did go down to that blank cell at the bottom, and I just clicked on dead and dragged down, just so that if we do have any blank cells, any no data entered, that it's going to go ahead and put that in correctly here. So once we do that lookup vector, we're going to go ahead and we have the results vector. So this is the code it's going to give whenever it finds one of those. So I'm just going to go ahead and highlight our codes here. And let's go ahead and close parentheses. And one more thing, since we're going to copy this cell down, we have to use some $signs, and that just keeps it so that Excel doesn't increment these numbers, this 5 and 9 and this 5 and 9 here when we drag down. And we can go ahead and hit enter there. And if you hit enter, you'll notice that this doesn't look like it's right. Poor, if we look at our metadata, should have been a code of 2. And the problem here is that the way this Excel function works, it actually needs these input values in alphabetical order. So I'm just going to put my cursor in that column. You don't want to highlight the whole column or anything. Just put your cursor on one of these values, and we'll sort from A to Z. So if we jump back over to our data, now it looks like it's right. Poor has 2. So we could go ahead and drag this formula all the way down because we put our dollar signs in. So you could just grab this handle here and drag it down, or you can double click and it'll fill all the way down. And you can see good is 4, fair is 3. So it looks like all that's working correctly. And we can go ahead and repeat the process, do the same thing for condition of leaves. So for condition of leaves, I'm just going to hit the equal sign, lookup, open parentheses. I'm just going to assign it the same value as before. So we could go through that process again. We could do the lookup again. Or we can just say that the condition of leaves equals the condition of void. And that'll work fine too in this case, since those two variables are going to be equal. We can fill that all the way down. So now we have species code, DBH, condition of void, condition of leaves. Okay, so you can go through this and you can do this for all your variables. I just want to include one more variable, and I'm just going to include this quadrant as our zone. So when you get your data into streets, you can start summarizing things by zone, which can be pretty useful. So we'll go ahead and we'll just take this quadrant and use it as our zone. So again, let's jump back over to the manual, and we see here zone can be a number or text, up to 20 characters, and we would leave it blank if we didn't record it. So I'm just going to go ahead and take this as it is because it's text. It looks like it should work fine. So we'll just go ahead and highlight that yellow and change this to zone. So I could go through and I could do a bunch more of these variables. I could use the other categories in streets, but in the interest of sort of keeping this video limited to maybe hopefully under a half hour here, I'm not going to do that. But if you want to look in the example that we have in the archives there, you'll see that on that metadata sheet there's a handful more variables that get imported into streets there, and you can see what the formatting looks like for each one of those. But I'm going to go ahead with these 5 variables we have here. So what I like to do at this point is I want to copy all this data into a new sheet and then delete the columns that I'm not actually going to import into streets. So all I do here is I hit Control A to select all, and I just like to use the quick keys. If you like to do it a different way, that's fine. So then you could right click here and copy, or I'm going to go ahead and press Control C to copy everything. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump over to a new tab here, an empty worksheet, and I'm just going to go ahead and instead of just pasting it regular, I want to go ahead and paste values. So a couple places I used formulas there where we were using the lookup tables and stuff like that. If I delete some columns, it's going to mess up those formulas. So I'm just going to go ahead here and paste values, and I want to paste the formatting too so we keep our highlighted columns. So now you'll see here these formulas back on our other sheet. For that condition of leaves, it actually had a formula in there because it equaled the other column. But when we did that paste special over here, we just get the values. So I'm going to change this to this tab down here. I'm just going to rename it Import Data so that I know what I'm dealing with. And then I'm just going to go ahead and delete everything that's not my data. So I'm just going to click on the letters at the top of the columns here that are in white, because I'm just going to keep the yellow columns. So I highlight all those and click delete, and just keep going through and delete everything that I'm not going to use. And just keep going here. And there we go. So I'm left with just these 5 columns that I'm going to import. That's pretty much the end of reformatting your data in Excel. Just a couple things to keep in mind. You just need to make sure that the format in each one of these columns matches exactly what's on in this table on page 25. You want to make sure that the column headings are spelled exactly the same. Any problems there is going to mess up the import, so we want to make sure that all our column headings here are spelled exactly the same. You only need to bring in the columns that you actually want to import, so you don't need every single one of these columns. If you had them, you could fill them with blanks or zeros if you didn't record them, but you can also just leave them out. And also the order here of the columns doesn't really matter either. It's just really important that you get that spelling right and that the data within each column are formatted correctly. And the one step that really sort of takes a lot of time is that species codes, converting everything to species codes. But it does make your life a whole lot easier when you bring it into streets. So that's pretty much reformatting your data in Excel. That's part one of this importing existing inventories into streets. And part two we'll pick up, we'll start trying to get this data into an Access database.